Podcasts are everywhere and have become one of the essential pieces of content used by brands to communicate their message through long-form conversation and their short-form counterparts. Today, we're going to go over everything that you need to know to start a podcast. Everything from why to start one in the first place to pre-production planning, equipment recommendations at different price points, software, plugins, and even how to optimize and distribute your podcast to achieve the best results. This is just the workflow that I've developed. You certainly don't have to use every specific tool that I reference. This is purely meant for you to get a sense of what is out there and then apply this to your circumstances. And just to note, while podcasts have traditionally referred to just audio, I'm going to be adding the video element. I think a lot of the principles we're going to be talking about will still be relevant to you if you just want to use audio, but it certainly doesn't hurt to create a video version of your podcast just to have as an alternative. First, let's cover why create a podcast in the first place. Podcasts allow you to build trust with your audience through familiarity because they're with you for an extended period of time. The long-form medium that a podcast provides really allows you to unlock impactful moments and get vulnerable in conversation, which takes time. And sometimes you can't explain a particular topic in just 30 seconds to a minute. You need a full conversation in order to do that. They're also very versatile, meaning that you can create many different pieces of content from one single recording, whether that be a full-length episode, clips for YouTube, or 30-second vertical reels for Instagram. It also elevates your status in your given industry. If people see you hosting your own show and having conversations with colleagues, business partners, and clients, it demonstrates the respect and influence you have, and people will notice that. And monetization is another great benefit of having a podcast, depending on your audience size and the ability to obtain sponsorships. It's just another way that you could potentially offset your production costs or generate some revenue from your content. It's a great opportunity to improve your conversation skills and also network. If you're having guests on your podcast, you're essentially creating an opportunity to sit down with someone that could be like-minded in your field and strengthen that business connection, that friendship, and that can go a long way. Typically, podcasts fall under one of two recording scenarios. Either they're recorded in person like this or remotely. Either way, I'd recommend investing in an external microphone. There are two mics that I would recommend. The first is the Blue Yeti, which I'm using to record right now, and it is the perfect combination of affordability and quality. It can connect to your computer through USB, where you can then select it as an audio source. You can adjust the gain and volume directly on the microphone, and it also gives you a couple of different pickup patterns to choose from. I've used this mic for years, not just for podcasts, but for voiceovers as well, so it's definitely a great investment as a first mic. If you want to upgrade to something a little bit more sophisticated, then you could take a look at the Shure MV7. And the great thing about this mic is that it has two different inputs. You can use USB or XLR. And what XLR enables is the ability to connect them to an audio recorder or audio interface. You can certainly use a traditional audio recorder like the Zoom H6, for example, but the limitation with this is the lack of headphone inputs and volume control. So for the purposes of podcast production, I'd actually recommend purchasing a dedicated podcast recorder like this Zoom PodTrack P4. This allows you to connect up to 4 microphones with 4 XLR inputs, and it has 4 corresponding headphone inputs so that you can monitor each microphone. And you have individual controls for the levels and headphone volume, which should be separate.
So you have multiple inputs, multiple outputs, multiple monitoring outputs, level adjustments for the mic in the mixer and for the headphones.
A way to connect multiple headphones to a recorder like the Zoom H6 would require a splitter, but this way isn't desirable because you don't have individual headphone volume control. And you don't want to be lowering the levels in order to bring the volume down in your headphones because we don't want that too low. So whether you're using one microphone or multiple, it's definitely worth investing in a podcast recorder because it leaves the door open for you to connect up to 4 microphones down the road. And of course, using audio recorders will involve SD cards, which you will then have to import the audio files later and synchronize them. And the separation of these audio channels is going to be imperative for the in-person podcast editing techniques and plugins that we're going to be referencing later. So just keep that in mind for now. And XLRs would absolutely be my recommendation for in-person recordings. But either way, whether you're doing remote or in-person, definitely invest in a good quality microphone or multiple, depending on how many people are going to be involved. There are many different ways you can go about mounting your mics. Some have a built-in desk mount like the Blue Yeti. You can also use mic arms, which tend to be a little bit more expensive, especially these that have an integrated XLR cable and built-in springs, but they really allow for a lot of flexibility. An inexpensive option is a stand like this, which you can just place on a desk, or you could also use a regular ground mic stand and suspend the mic over where you need. If you're wondering whether you should wear headphones or not, you can really go either way. But some of the reasons why you might want to are for monitoring, and it's also more immersive. By monitoring, I'm referring to making sure that the volume is consistent throughout the recording. Wearing headphones also gives you another level of self-awareness. So if you lean back or lean forward, you can adjust the mic accordingly so that the levels sound good throughout. And just as another option, there are studios that you can rent out that already have everything set up. So all you have to do is arrive and press record. So if you don't want to deal with all of this, then it's just another alternative that you could keep in mind. What should you talk about on your podcast? Well, let me give you some ideas. You can tell a story, do a Q&A based on audience questions, which is a great way to engage with your community. You can teach a lesson, explain a concept, or conduct an interview. Just think about ways to take advantage of this long-form content medium, which contrasts from the short-form content and only having a minute or so to speak to your audience. So if you're having a guest on your podcast, it's always good to have a plan. Write some questions down. This doesn't mean that you can't be spontaneous, but guide the conversation in a direction that you want it to go with your audience in mind. The software that I use for facilitating these remote podcast recordings is called Riverside. This browser-based software allows you to create a virtual studio where everyone can log in, and everyone that enters the studio can have different roles, whether that be the host, guest, or producer. And all of the recording and settings are handled on your end as the host, which makes it very simple and straightforward for your guests. All they have to do is click the link and enter the studio and then log off when the recording is finished. The only caveat with Riverside as of right now is that it requires a Chrome browser, which I know can be sort of inconvenient for some people that don't use that. The thing that I like about using Riverside is that it tends to have higher quality due to the fact that it's recording locally to your device instead of over the internet. And what this means is that if there's a glitch or interference during the recording, that won't show up because it's being recorded locally, and then it uploads it once the recording is done, where you can download them from Riverside. You could potentially do all of your remote podcast editing in Riverside. It has text-based editing, the ability to customize a layout, add captions, remove filler words, apply audio enhancement, and even generate social clips like we talked about before. So this could be your all-in-one recording and editing solution for remote podcasts if that's what you're looking for. I'll leave a link to Riverside below if you're interested in checking it out. I've used it myself for the past couple years so many times, not just for podcasts, but also remote testimonial recordings. So it's definitely a great tool to have in your toolbox as a video professional. So whenever I'm having a guest on a remote recording, I always brief them to be conscious of their environment. It sounds simple, but just basic things like having plenty of natural light or an artificial light so they're not just a giant shadow, that goes a long way. Having their camera elevated so that we're not looking up their nostrils, and making sure that if it's in their control, that they're in a quiet place so that the audio doesn't have a lot of background noise. And you could also recommend that they themselves connect their own external microphone. Regarding external video sources, the simplest option would be to connect a webcam like the Logitech C920 that I'm using right now. And this can add video capabilities to your desktop computer or be an upgrade to the built-in webcam on your laptop. If you do use a Logitech webcam, I would highly recommend downloading the software that goes along with it so that you can tweak the settings, because as you can see, the auto exposure tends to be very bright and it doesn't have great dynamic range. But prioritizing the framing and lighting are going to go a long way. It's not just about the model of camera, it's about the implementation of it. One way to really level up the quality of your remote recordings is by connecting a mirrorless camera to your computer and then selecting that as a video source. You can do that by using this adapter here called a cam link, and this essentially allows you to use your camera's HDMI connection and convert that to USB, which allows you to connect it to your computer. And then it will be recognizable within Riverside's interface, and you can select it and you're good to go. To light most of the shots that you're seeing in this video, I used my Aperture LED panels, and I've also recently purchased a dedicated desk light, which is a great option if you want one that is specifically designed for desks and one that you can keep permanently mounted. But either way, I will link all of the lights that I'm using in this video below. I actually have a remote recording PDF guide that you can refer to, and it outlines all of this in a written format. And you can send this to your guests in advance instead of having to write up an entire email. And hopefully they can apply this and show up to your call looking and sounding great. Now, if you're recording an in-person podcast, you can obviously have your microphones that I mentioned set up before for each guest. Then you can have one camera that shows everybody or have a dedicated camera on each person. So what are some of the reasons why you might want to use a multi-camera setup when filming an in-person podcast?
I think there's a couple reasons, but mainly for the editing and editing around stutters, silences, ums and ahs. Also, you have pattern interrupts, which is, you don't want to stay on a shot too long. You don't want things to be too stale. So you always want different angles to cut from.
And this is all especially important if it's an hour-long episode or more. You want to get all the interest that you can in editing, because if you stay on one shot, you're very limited in terms of what you can do. And this is going to be a bit more complicated to edit than the remote recordings that we just talked about on Riverside, because you're going to have a bunch of video and audio files that you need to synchronize. Fortunately, I use a plugin called PluralEyes, which makes this so simple. I just drag all of my video and audio tracks in to my timeline, and then I use the extension in Premiere, and it creates another sequence with all of the waveforms aligned automatically, which saves a tremendous amount of time and is just more accurate overall as opposed to lining them up manually. And you can also use the desktop app and drag all of them in, and it will generate an XML for your given editing software. And then once I have everything synchronized, I will then apply this incredible plugin called AutoPod, which will take care of the multi-camera switching for me. Now, in order for this to work, you have to put the video and corresponding microphone audio in their own nests and have the in and out points match. But once all that is set up, AutoPod will take care of switching the cameras to whoever is speaking, obviously provided that you did multiple cameras. And this in and of itself saves me probably 1 to 2 hours of having to switch the cameras myself. I'll link AutoPod below. It's an absolute game changer if you're doing multicam in-person podcast episodes. Unfortunately, right now it's only exclusive to Premiere. Maybe they'll be expanding the software compatibility down the road, but if you're a Premiere user, it's an absolute must-have. For remote podcasts, one thing that I like to do once I download all of the recordings from Riverside is to have solo views and then a side-by-side view. And this adds some variety when cutting around, and it's also perfect for covering up jump cuts. And you can also get really creative with how you design the framing of these remote recordings. You don't just have to have them on a black background. You can create really nice lower thirds and titles, and then frame them up so they're nicely positioned and cropped. And for the full video version, I think it goes a long way to establish a look and feel, whether that be conveyed through the intro, the lower thirds, the framing like we talked about for the remote recordings, having an outro and transitions. For your short form content, having a specific style of captions that you're using, or a watermark, a logo. All these things are going to go a long way to making a really great first impression. And of course, overall, you want to make sure that you are mixing your audio, which refers to balancing all of your tracks and making sure that they peak at the same level. A rule of thumb that I use is making sure that the audio peaks at around -6 dB. And then I'll usually apply a parametric equalizer and a light instance of denoiser. There are two really powerful AI tools that I would recommend checking out. One is the Adobe Audio Enhancer. If you pay for an Adobe subscription, you already have this. You can use the browser-based tool, or they're working on integrating one into the Essential Sound panel. This is so powerful and can really eliminate all the background noise from your audio and really boost the lower frequencies and make it sound totally brand new. It can take poorly recorded audio and make it sound like it was recorded in a professional studio. And one more that I've used is called Auphonic, and this one has more detailed controls, so definitely worth checking out all of these. And once I have my in-person or remote episode synchronized and ready to go, I will then watch it through, sped up, and this allows me to manually inspect every second and make sure that no technical issues are falling through the cracks. And if you're editing a podcast, this is especially important if you were not involved with the actual recording. And this tends to be the case for me, is that I'm being given footage from my clients and I don't know, unless I listen to it, if everything is okay or not. And they could be telling me halfway through a 2-hour recording, Dylan, cut this out, we're gonna redo this part. So you can't just look at the waveform and really have an accurate judgment of if everything is okay to be kept in or not. The text-based editing that I mentioned before is a really great way to get a bird's eye view of your full recording. Most softwares these days have a text-based editing feature like Premiere Pro and Riverside. There's also Descript, which I've used before, and that's great if you didn't record in Riverside or are looking for a standalone software outside of Adobe. So if the text-based editing appeals to you more, then definitely check those out. But another reason that I manually watch these through is that it helps me assure that the camera switching is correct, because sometimes Autopod will cut to someone who is picking their nose, for example, which is obviously undesirable. So this gives me the certainty that the cuts are precise and intentional. But Autopod puts this on cruise control and the adjustments are usually minimal if there are any at all. And watching it through all the way also gives me the chance to leave markers on the sequence at moments that I think would make for good sound bites for the short form content. Now, with regards to editing and post-production, the full-length episode, generally speaking, is not that creative. It's really just making sure that everything is technically usable, and obviously maybe adding an intro, outro, or lower thirds. What I will do on occasion is add a 10 or 20 second teaser to the beginning of the full episode, and that can get the listener intrigued by getting a small glimpse of what they can expect. But you can really get creative with these short form reels. And from editing so many podcasts at this point, I just have these alarm bells that go off when I'm listening to something. I can immediately recognize if this should be a social clip or not. And that'll be something that you'll learn, or you'll know from trial and error, having posted a lot of them, what performs well and what doesn't. But these short form clips are really important because they're going to serve as the most front facing aspect of your podcast. And in most cases, they drive the most traffic and they get the most views. So I would definitely get good at recognizing the moments that should be set aside for editing the short form content later. Now I know what you're thinking, Dylan, why in the world would you edit these manually when we have tools like Opus Clip that can take a long form episode and cut them down into clips automatically using AI? And I think that could be a perfectly good option for you. In fact, I would encourage that you try out these tools that do that. But for me, I just like to take a very specific, detailed approach to editing these, and I like to have control down to the exact frame and pixel. And from my experience, using Opus and a text-based editor just doesn't give me that flexibility to do that. But I think depending on what you're looking for and the level of editing knowledge that you have, say you don't like working in editing software, then using something like Opus Clip may have a more intuitive and user-friendly interface for you. Or you could do a combination where Opus will isolate the sections and then you can output an XML, which is a skeleton of an editing sequence, and then you can import that into your traditional nonlinear editor like Premiere and fine tune from there. And this is something that I've been experimenting with, seeing if I can get the best of both worlds. I'm going to be going over my process right now. I'll duplicate my sequence several times and isolate the sections that I have marked for these social clips. And then I will refine and cut out all of the non-usable content, which includes all of the dead, empty space in the audio. And then I will change the aspect ratio to 9:16, which is vertical. And then I will scale the clips up to fill the 9:16 frame. There are several guidelines that I like to follow with short form content, and one of them is changing the frame every 3 seconds or so, whether that's using a punch in or a zoom, or cutting in and out, or incorporating images like stock footage or photos. You've probably heard this before, but everyone's attention spans are very short, so you constantly want to be keeping things interesting with this short form content so that you keep people engaged and interested. Now, obviously this depends on the subject matter. Maybe you do want to slow things down and make it emotional, and that could absolutely work as well. So it depends, but I would say overall, you definitely want to spice things up. And like I said, get creative with these. If you're looking for resources for stock footage, I personally use and recommend Soundstripe. And this is great because it allows me to license music, stock footage, and sound effects all in one subscription, all for $400 a year, which I think is really good value. And you get unlimited downloads. I'll link that below in case you want to check it out. I've also used Envato, which has more graphical elements and animations with templates. I would just make sure that you're properly licensing everything, or just make sure that you have permission to use the visuals that you are using. I know some people like to bend the rules, but I would just be conscious of that. And one of the anchors of short form content is captions. The majority of people will actually watch social content with the audio off. So having captions is imperative. There are two different options you can take with captions. One of them is to generate them natively in your editing software, and the other is to use a third-party app, and we're going to cover both of those. So say for example in Premiere, I can generate the captions automatically, and I can set whether I want them on 1 or 2 lines and the amount of characters per line, and I have all of the character, paragraph, and alignment tools in the Essential Graphics panel. And this gives me absolutely full control over every aspect of the captions. I can add drop shadows, I can add a stroke level behind them for visibility, I can highlight certain words and change the colors, I can align the captions so that they cut whenever the video cuts, which makes things look cleaner. And then I also have this caption animation plugin that I'll link below, where I can convert the captions to graphic layers and then drag them on, and it will add some scaling or more dynamic movement to them, which goes a long way. You can also use a platform like Submagic. So say that you manually cut down your social clip, you can then import that into Submagic, and it will generate the captions for you. They'll be already animated, different colors, emojis. So this might be a good option to consider. Like I said before, if you're not very proficient with the traditional timeline-based editing softwares, this would be perfect for you. Generally speaking, I will find myself doing them manually, because the way that I look at it is that I'll have to be proofreading the captions anyway, so I might as well just do that in Premiere instead of doing that in a browser-based tool. Another thing to keep in mind are safe zones. So you want to make sure that your captions are not positioned too low, or that some of the graphical user interface elements won't be covering up anything important in your framing. And these are things to consider when optimizing your short form reels to perform the best that they possibly can. You've probably heard this before, but in short form content, the first 3 seconds are so important for engagement. Good hooks that I've used are controversial statements, an intriguing question, providing a statistic, or starting a list. So with that being said, you may have to reorder some sentences from how they happened organically, so that the most intriguing part happens in the first 3 seconds. Now, once you have everything recorded, edited, and ready to post, how do you distribute it? For the full-length episode, I'd recommend using Buzzsprout, which is most efficient because you just upload your file once, and it will then distribute it to all of the major platforms that you decide. And then all the short form content can go on Instagram, YouTube Shorts, LinkedIn, and these are usually at the top of the funnel. They're going to be seen by the most people, and they're designed to drive traffic to your website, the full podcast, and your personal brand overall, which is why I spent a lot of time talking about them, because it's something you should absolutely take advantage of when recording a podcast. So I hope that this was helpful for you. I'm certainly learning so much about podcast production every day, and I'm thankful that I've been able to work on a lot of great podcasts, which I'll link below if you're interested in checking them out. If you're interested in podcast production or post-production services, then feel free to reach out to me at Delaney Video, my production company, and we can take care of this for you. I wish you the best of luck with your podcast, and thanks for watching.